The morning after the porch, the kitchen looked like it had hosted someone else's life. Two wine glasses sat in the sink without shame. The Bluetooth speaker blinked its little blue light as if it had only ever played weather reports. I stood there longer than a plate deserves and made the kind of coffee you brew when you need your hands to do something unarguable. I left the glasses unwashed on purpose. Tiny experiment. I wanted to see if the smell turned on me. By mid-afternoon, the sweetness at the rims had gone sour. The way fruit does when the bowl it sits in is prettier than the fruit itself. I snapped a picture, not for court and not for HR, just for the me who would try to convince himself later that it hadn't been that bad. Phones are good liars until they have to hold pictures. I called my boss at facilities and said I'd be in late, voice steady. He's a former Marine with a new grandson and a superstition about Tuesdays. He said take the time you need and bring your key card because the security office changes codes every time a squirrel looks at the server room wrong. He didn't ask for details. There's a grace to men who let you keep your own nouns. On campus, the air felt clean in a way houses rarely do after they learn new words. An undergrad with a hat that didn't know if it wanted to be backward or forward asked me if the freight elevator in Dalton could be trusted yet. I told him it could be trusted as much as anything built in 1978. He laughed and said that was the kind of honesty he could major in. Between work orders, I built a timeline. Not the revenge kind, the kind that backs up what your mouth says when someone with a badge asks what time was. I used the calendar I keep for coil replacements and inspections and added a second color for my life. I wrote 6012 p.m., pulled into driveway. 6012 p.m., heard playlist from guest room. 6016 p.m., open door. 6020 p.m., shove. 6020 p.m., porch. 6020 p.m., 911. I layered in the ring timestamps and the police CAD printout my lawyer pulled later. I added the ER note, elevated BP, observable tremor, short-term stress response. I wrote it like someone else would have to read it because that's how you keep from performing. 2 days passed before Lindsay texted a single sentence that tried to be both brave and soft. I think we should talk like adults. I wrote back, I'm available with counsel present. She replied, that's aggressive. I said, that's careful. She sent 3 dots, then nothing, which is a kind of answer. The neighbor with the ring footage, Jason, caught me at the mailbox after work. He's the kind of man who apologizes when his tulips do well and yours don't. He held his phone like a hot plate and showed me the clip again, even though I'd already saved the file. He said, I've been married 23 years, and I have never not wanted to be a witness. I said, I appreciate you. We both looked at the street like it might say something back. My lawyer, Hale, thick tie, thin patience, had me come in to sign releases and to repeat the story without adjectives, which is a hard trick when your stomach thinks every noun is a trap. He told me the city prosecutor was reasonable and that our ask would be a plea to a reduced charge with conditions, pointing to the doorbell clip and the 911 call. I asked what conditions meant. He said classes, a fine, maybe community service, maybe a short unsupervised probation. He said if you go to trial, you can win a truth and lose a life. I nodded like a man who fixes things that don't care about his feelings. On the 3rd day after the porch, a little square envelope showed up in the mailbox with my name in handwriting I knew too well. Inside was a card with embossed leaves and the most Lindsay sentence that ever existed. We were never right, and we tried to be right by refusing what was true. I am not sorry for wanting more for both of us. I am sorry that I did not know how to want it without breaking things you cared about. I stared at the sentence until the leaves went blurry. She wasn't wrong about the first half. We had been trying to make a geometry that didn't fit. It does not absolve the math you choose because triangles are pretty. In the quiet parts, I made lists. Replace nightstand in guest room. Change Bluetooth pairing code on speaker. Call insurer again to confirm flag. Freeze joint credit line. Unfreeze mine. Call mortgage servicer and request copies of any third-party calls. Lift every rug you've been pretending isn't hiding grit. The list grew and then started shrinking. There's joy in crossing off verbs. It feels like winning without anyone losing. On a Wednesday that didn't ask for drama, Lindsay's HR replied to my anonymous packet with an email that said, thank you for your concern. The company takes compliance seriously, and we do not comment on internal personnel matters. That's corporate for, we got it, and we're going to do what the policy says until someone with a better policy tells us not to. I printed it anyway because silence printed still counts. Evan's name went quiet on Lindsay's mouth. That's an odd sensation, realizing a person has become a pronoun in rooms you can't see. A week later, a colleague of hers, someone we'd had beers with back when beers were still allowed, texted me by mistake. Hey, any chance you know what floor they moved Lindsay to? I wrote back the wrong number and then a second later the right one, because I am not here to be a saboteur, just a man with labels. The pre-trial hearing was a room full of chairs arranged to make you feel both watched and ignored. I wore the only tie my sister says makes me look like I belong anywhere near a lectern. Hale sat next to me with a legal pad he would barely use because he prefers to keep his eyes on faces. The prosecutor introduced himself with a handshake that didn't try to crush me or be pals. He said he'd reviewed the reports in the clip. He said these cases are messy because the moment that brings everyone to the courthouse is almost never the first moment that mattered. He said if we entered a plea to a minor count, He'd recommend 6 months unsupervised probation, an anger management course, and a small fine. It wasn't an admission of being the villain, it was an admission that the shove happened and we were choosing adults over audience. Hale glanced at me. My jaw did a thing. I thought about elevators and how we chain them off when they're misbehaving, not because we hate their freedom, but because broken machines can take your fingers with them while they figure themselves out. I said yes. The judge said my name flat and fair. I answered without trying to be interesting. The whole thing took 7 minutes and left a mark that paperwork knows how to carry. Anger management class meets in a church basement with chairs that make everyone look like a boy again. The instructor is a woman who has never pretended anything. She started by asking us to define anger without using the word control. A younger guy with a jaw clenched like he wanted to crack said anger is a cover for fear. An older guy who smelled like diesel said anger is heat with nowhere to go. I said anger is a useful warning. It's the behaviors that make the news. She wrote all three on a whiteboard that wheezed and said, "Congratulations, you all own a dictionary." In one session, she asked us to diagram an event: precipitating factor, thought, feeling, behavior, consequence. We put the guest room on the board because I was the one with the arrest, so mine was easiest to locate. Precipitating factor came home to unexpected sound and light. Thought, betrayal, feeling, a whole chorus. Behavior, shove, consequence, charge, paperwork, shame, this room. Then we did it again with a second column that asked what behavior could have been selected if you were allowed a 10-second pause. I put step back and blocked doorway with a forearm without pushing. Someone else put call 911 from hallway and name what is happening out loud to change everyone's brain. Someone else said pray, and I wrote it too because you can dislike God and still like the pause a prayer gives you. It didn't make me a hero. It made the next version of me slightly more likely to count. At work, I told maintenance I couldn't be the one to meet with a vendor whose office was in the same building as Lindsay's. Not because I was scared, I was out of shape for coincidences. The supervisor said no problem, then added, "We've all been there," which is the kindest way a man in his 60s can tell you he remembers something he won't talk about until the second beer. On Fridays, the crew started asking me what the best way was to mark the end of a run of bad weeks. I said label everything you touched, and then put the label maker away. Jason's wife, Kara, stopped me one evening to return a socket set I didn't remember lending her and said, "My sister works on Lindsay's floor. She says HR removed her from the committee that plans off-site team events." It was the most specific confirmation of consequence possible. I nodded and said thank you for the socket set. She said, "I know you're not dragging her name. I want you to know the world sometimes still drags itself." I smiled and went inside and sat on the edge of the guest bed and let myself cry properly for the first time. Not the choked, breathless, leaky kind, but the quiet shoulders kind. The playlist stayed off. The lamplight was honest. Lindsay's second attempt to frame the narrative came via email. The subject line was simply perspective. The body read like an argument she'd been practicing in the mirror. She wrote that she felt alone, that I had married my job, that the house got more at me than she did, that Evan wasn't the first person to make her feel seen, and that if I was honest, I'd admit my own small betrayals of attention. She wrote that she'd said, "separated in our hearts," because she believed it, and because saying separated in our calendar would have been dishonest. She closed by expressing a hope we could not let one bad night rewrite a decade. I reread the last sentence twice, then opened my folder and put the email behind the ER note and in front of the insurance message, a quiet curating of a museum no one else would tour. Hale called with the plea paperwork and the scheduling for the class and a reminder to keep my own counsel. He told me he'd reached out to the city attorney with the neighbor's clip to leave in the file for the record's sake. He told me to keep the copy of the 911 recording he'd requested. Sometimes you need to hear your own voice not breaking to remember it can be done. He told me to expect a short, formal sentencing hearing with a judge who didn't need tears. I wrote all that down in the margin of my coil maintenance checklist because I like to see different layers of my life share a page without fighting. On sentencing day, the courtroom was half full of people who looked like they got in bad directions and ended up in a story instead of a building. Lindsay didn't come. Evan didn't come. Hale stood, said my name along with a dozen phrases that translate as, "This was not a man shopping for violence." The prosecutor repeated the deal. The judge asked if I had anything to say. I said no, sir, because it wasn't a time for the part of me that rehearses speeches on jogs. He sentenced me to exactly what had been offered, no more, no less, and then he went on to the next case because courtrooms are conveyor belts. I paid the fine that afternoon with my debit card, which still felt like my hand. I stuck the receipt behind the ER note because paper likes to hold hands with its cousins. I went home and made pasta that tasted like a decision, which is to say it tasted like salt and garlic and not regret. Lindsay's mother cornered me at the grocery store by the lemons, which fell 2 on the nose. She said, "I raised a daughter who is not a villain," and I said, "I'm not publishing her as one," and we both reached for a plastic bag at the same time and then did that dance where you pretend not to know how to share. She said, "Do you love her still?" And I said, "I love the version we tried to be before we learned we were lying." And she looked at the lemons and said, "That must be very heavy." We parted like we were going to meet again soon, and of course we were not. On a Saturday morning that wanted to be about nothing, Jason asked if I'd help him set up a basketball hoop for his kids. The manual assumed you had 3 men and a calm God. We had 2 men and sarcasm. While we wrestled with the backboard and its moral center, he asked if I'd heard about Lindsay's portfolio reassignments. I said I had heard rumors and didn't want to be the kind of person who tapes them to a wall. He said that was fair. Then he told me a story about the first time he learned to keep his mouth shut in public and how it saved a friendship that deserved saving. I filed that away under men teaching each other how not to be fools. Anger management ended with a worksheet that looked like it had been designed for sixth graders and helped like it had been designed for surgeons, triggers, supports, lines I could say when my breath got short. This is what is happening. I don't need to fix it with my hands. I can leave. I practiced the lines out loud in the truck on the drive home and felt absurd and then grateful, the way you do when you memorize a phone number you hope never to dial. The day HR finished its internal review. How do I know? Because the tone of an email from Lindsay changed from combative to clipped. And because a former colleague who owes me nothing sent a message that simply read, "They moved her," was the day I finally put the guest room back together for people and not plot. I took the speaker out entirely and set it in the garage on a shelf with a piece of tape labeled "Other People's Noises." I changed the lamp for a floor model that gave the room a softer insistence. I bought a throw blanket that didn't need anyone's opinion. I stood in the doorway and liked it enough to leave it alone. A month after sentencing, Lindsay sent another email, shorter, which is to say more honest. "I'm sorry for the part where I hurt you." She didn't say which part. I didn't require that she did. I moved it to the folder and went for a run where the river shrugged and the geese tried to look like senators. If you ever want to know how thin a life can feel when it's mostly paperwork, try eating dinner alone with the television off for a week. For a while, the chair across from me felt like an exhibit in a museum dedicated to my worst day. Then it started feeling like a chair again. I started cooking for the counter instead of for an opinion. I added pepper without asking whether it fit our brand. The quiet grew kind. I never posted. I never typed a subtweet that could be traced. I didn't leave a review of a man on the internet. That's not because I'm a saint. It's because I sat in too many lobbies and watched men who needed audience more than outcome get nothing they wanted. Silence is not weakness if you hand your silence to the right folder. Do you want details about the final division of our life? The judge signed off on a decree that our attorneys wrote with boring kindness. We each kept our retirement accounts. We closed the joint card after I paid off the last 2 dinners I hadn't eaten. I kept the house because the doorbell camera lives here and because sometimes the person who calls 911 gets to keep the porch where he called. There was no alimony. There were no children to pretend to be reasonable for. The dog we had for 6 years died the summer before. In a way, she saved us from arguing about love in a courtroom. I fixed the cabinet hinge in the laundry room. I replaced the inline water filter behind the fridge. I lubricated 3 hinges and realized that for months I'd been living in a house that squeaked and I'd been too tired to notice. I put new felt on the chair legs to stop the scraping sound that used to make Lindsay reach for a look she called care and I called performance. The house began to sound like a place where a person lived who had chosen it. Evan, for those who came for gossip, posted a photo 2 months later of a mountain with the caption "New Perspectives." It had a filter I don't own. The likes were polite. Lindsay posted a photo with a caption about growth that didn't include my name. I didn't like it and I didn't hate it. I scrolled on. Jason's kids took to shooting hoops after dinner with the kind of determination only children and certain athletes have. One evening, the ball bounced into my yard and the younger one knocked on my door to ask if he could grab it. I said of course and he said thanks Mr. Morgan and then asked if I wanted to shoot one. The sound of the ball snapping the net felt like a sentence ending properly. I missed my first 3 and made the 4th and he said nice and I felt the kind of proud you're allowed. On the last day of my 6-month probation, I checked my email 8 times for a message that would say, in as few words as possible, that the state was done thinking about me. The email arrived in 2017 with a subject line that read, "Completion of terms." I printed it and, without ceremony, filed it behind the plea paperwork. I went out to the porch with a beer and a bag of peanuts with shells that get everywhere. I raised the bottle to no one in particular and to the version of myself who chose a phone over a fight. The night smelled like cut grass and a neighbor's bad idea on a grill. I let the bad idea go. Lindsay will have her own timeline, one I don't get and don't need to understand. A friend swears she moved apartments across town, says the new place has big windows that drink sunset like it owes them. That sounds right for her. I don't wish her a small life, I wish her an honest one. If that reads like magnanimity, you haven't seen what self-preservation looks like written in a calendar. There's a famous line about how character is what you do when no one is watching. I don't know. I think character is what your paperwork says when people who don't care about you read it aloud. When your voice shakes, let your papers talk. It won't make you a hero, it'll make you credible. You ask for a longer story. Really, it's a longer silence you learn to use. It's the breath you take on the porch before you dial. It's the choice to copy a file before you cry. It's the willingness to sit at a warm table and put cold documents between you and the person who once knew where you kept everything. It's the decision not to add adjectives to a judge's day. A year to the week after the guest room, I took the day off and drove out to a state park where the paths are tidy and the trees agree. I left my phone in the truck and walked until my knees got opinionated. At a bend by a creek that sounded like the hum behind the servers at work, I sat and said the names of things out loud. Water, rock, leaf, breath. If you do it long enough without sentimentalizing it, the world starts acting like it remembers you. I walked back to the parking lot and saw the truck like it was the first time and liked the way the sun made its scratches look like decisions. That night, I put the playlist on, not to relive anything, to remind my spine we own sounds. The song we danced to at the courthouse slid in, and I let it be a song. I wiped down the counter, I turned off the lamp, I checked the locks, I whispered goodnight to a house that didn't need it. I slept like a man who had finally finished a form. Would you have done it this way? Would you have chosen documents over drama? Would you have built a case for your own calm instead of a story for other people's consumption? Or would you have gone loud and made sure a lobby knew your name? I'm not judging your answer. I'm telling you, mine kept my job and my front porch and the sound of a basketball net at 7 p.m. Tell me where you land. Drop your take in the comments and tell me if you've ever let paper speak for you when your hands wanted to do something dumber. If this story hit you back, hit like and subscribe. Another one's already in the queue.